Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1: The Arrival of Dr. Forsyth. Are you certain you wouldn't prefer the front room, sir? It's got a fine view of the village green. Edith Cavendish stood in the dimly lit corridor of the Rosewood Inn, watching as Dr. Alistair Forsyth, a man well past his prime, adjusted his heavy satchel on his shoulder. He barely acknowledged her, his thin lips pressed together in a grim line. "No," he said at last, his voice dry and clipped. "The back room will do." He handed over a neatly folded banknote, his eyes darting towards the staircase. Edith hesitated before tucking the money into her apron pocket. "As you wish, sir." She led him up the stairs to a modest guest room at the rear of the inn. It was a small but comfortable space, with a writing desk near the window and a heavy oak wardrobe in the corner. He stepped inside and set his satchel on the bed, immediately fastening the latch on the door behind him. Edith frowned. There was something unsettling about the man. His anxious glances, the way he clutched his case as though it contained something far more valuable than a travelling scholar's effects. She had seen all sorts come through the inn over the years, but Dr. Forsyth was different. He was hiding something. That evening, the common room of the Rosewood Inn buzzed with quiet conversation. The rain outside tapped insistently against the window panes, and the fire in the hearth crackled, sending flickering shadows across the oak beams. "Dr. Forsyth, is it?" Len Marsh, the village historian, leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the staircase. "Odd fellow. Kept to himself all afternoon. He's an archaeologist," Edith replied, absently wiping a glass behind the bar. "Something about ancient manuscripts, I believe," Len scoffed. "That's so. He ought to be careful where he sticks his nose. Some people don't take kindly to men like him digging up the past." Edith shot him a warning glance, but Len wasn't one to be deterred. He drained the last of his drink and stood, making his way to the staircase. Minutes later, in the dim hallway outside Forsyth's door, Len knocked firmly. "Dr. Forsyth, it's Leonard Marsh, historian, like yourself." Silence. Len rapped again, more insistent this time. The door opened only a fraction, revealing Forsyth's pale, lined face. His eyes flickered with irritation. "What do you want?" Len smirked. "I imagine you know exactly what I want, Doctor." Forsyth exhaled sharply. "If you've come to discuss business, I am not interested." "You might be," Len countered, "considering what you stole." Forsyth's expression darkened, his grip tightening on the edge of the door. "That is a dangerous accusation, Mr. Marsh." Len stepped forward, lowering his voice. "The missing manuscript, Forsyth. The one that vanished from the Digby collection. I know you had it." Forsyth's jaw clenched. "Leave, now!" With that, he shut the door in Len's face, the lock clicking firmly into place. Later that night, Edith passed by Forsyth's room on her way to put out the hall lamps. A sliver of candlelight flickered beneath the door. She paused, straining to hear, inside the scratch of a pen on paper, the rustling of fabric, a heavy sigh. Then the distinct crackle of burning parchment. Edith's brows furrowed. Burning something? At this hour? She lingered a moment longer, but no further sound came from the room. Shaking her head, she continued down the corridor, unaware that this would be the last time anyone saw Dr. Alistair Forsyth alive. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. Mystery. A cool mist hung over St. Mary Mead as morning broke, casting a grey pall over the village. The Rosewood Inn stirred to life as guests and staff went about their morning routines. Edith Cavendish moved briskly through the dining room, setting out teacups and arranging the breakfast tray for Dr. Forsyth. She hesitated outside his door, balancing the tray against her hip as she knocked. "Dr. Forsyth?" Silence. She rapped again, louder this time. "Your breakfast, sir." Still nothing. A prickle of unease ran up her spine. She pressed her ear to the door. No sounds of movement, no shuffling of papers, no clinking of a teacup. Nothing. Her fingers tightened on the tray as she turned the handle. Locked. Edith took a step back, frowning. It wasn't unusual for guests to sleep in, but something about the stillness felt wrong. She knocked once more, harder, then called down the hallway, "George, come up here a moment." Her husband, the innkeeper, appeared at the bottom of the stairs, wiping his hands on his apron. "What is it?" "It's Dr. Forsyth. He isn't answering, and the door's locked." George sighed, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. He rapped his knuckles against the wood. "Dr. Forsyth?" No response. Edith looked at her husband. "We should open it." George hesitated before sighing and reaching into his pocket for the inn's spare key. He slid it into the lock and turned. The door creaked open. The room was empty. Edith stepped inside, setting the breakfast tray on the desk. The bed was unmade, as if someone had left in haste. The chair by the window was oddly positioned, almost as if it had been dragged there deliberately. But the most unsettling detail was the door's lock. It had been bolted from the inside. "Where on earth has he gone?" George muttered. Edith crossed the room and peered out of the window. The ground below was undisturbed. There was no trellis, no convenient ledge, no conceivable way a man of Forsyth's age could have climbed out. And yet he was gone. Word of the disappearance spread quickly through the village. By midday, Inspector Harold Greaves had arrived, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable, as he stood in Forsyth's vacant room, arms crossed. "You're certain the door was locked from the inside?" he asked. George nodded. "Yes, Inspector. And the window? Well, you can see for yourself. No way out." Greaves let out a slow breath. "Suicide's the likeliest explanation." Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly in the hallway, spoke up for the first time. "But there's no body, Inspector." Greaves turned, his expression cooling slightly. "Mrs. Marple." She smiled politely. "Forgive me, Inspector, but if Dr. Forsyth took his own life, where, pray, is he?" Greaves glanced at the window again before shaking his head. "Perhaps he wandered off in the night. An elderly man, confused. Dr. Forsyth did not strike me as the confused sort," Miss Marple mused. "And an archaeologist, no less. Accustomed to careful planning and detail. No, Inspector, something about this does not fit." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. A farmhand burst into the inn, his face pale. "They've found him," he stammered. "Out near the woods. Dr. Forsyth, dead. The scene at the edge of the village was grim. Forsyth's body lay slumped at the base of a stone wall, his face pale and expressionless, his spectacles askew. The dampness of the grass suggested he had been there for hours. Miss Marple observed everything, her keen gaze taking in every detail. His overcoat was buttoned, as if he had dressed purposefully before leaving. His pocket watch, still clutched in one hand, had stopped at midnight. Greaves exhaled sharply. "There's our answer. The man left the inn on his own. Perhaps he intended to take a walk, had an attack, collapsed." Miss Marple glanced at the ground. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, save for those of the farmhand who had found the body. She crouched slightly, noting the absence of something crucial, his walking cane. "Inspector," she said lightly, "where is his cane?" Greaves frowned. "What?" Miss Marple straightened. "Dr. Forsyth carried a cane. He never walked without it, and yet it isn't here." Greaves opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned to one of the constables. "Search the surrounding area. Find the cane." The men fanned out, combing the grass and hedgerows, but after nearly an hour there was no sign of it. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her handbag. A locked room, an impossible disappearance, and now a missing walking cane. No, this was no accident. Dr. Forsyth had been murdered. Back at the inn the tension was thick. Edith wrung her hands behind the bar, staring at the floor as if lost in thought. Len Marsh sat at his usual spot by the fire, his expression unreadable. "You see," he muttered at last, "I told you he was a man with enemies." Edith shot him a sharp look. "What are you implying?" Len shrugged. "Only that some men dig too deep, and sometimes they don't like what they find." Miss Marple, seated nearby, folded her hands. "It's a most curious thing," she said almost to herself. "A locked door, a vanished guest, and a body appearing where it shouldn't be." She turned to Edith. "Forgive me, Mrs. Cavendish, but do you recall Dr. Forsyth receiving any visitors that night?" Edith hesitated. "No," she said, "not that I saw." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then how, I wonder, did he leave a locked room?" The silence that followed was almost tangible. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. And then Edith swallowed, her hands still trembling. Miss Marple's sharp eyes didn't miss it. Something was very, very wrong. "Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below." Chapter 3. The Missing Manuscript. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its share of peculiar happenings, but a man vanishing from a locked room and turning up dead was quite another matter. By the afternoon following Dr. Forsyth's discovery, the Rosewood Inn had become the centre of gossip and speculation. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the common room, knitting in hand, though her attention was elsewhere. She had spent many years listening, observing, understanding human nature. And human nature, she knew, often revealed more than it intended. At the bar, Edith Cavendish had grown increasingly restless. She moved about with hurried efficiency, but her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the counter. Something troubled her. Miss Marple noted this, tucking the detail away for later. Len Marsh, for his part, was brooding over his drink. His usual self-assured air diminished. He had spoken the night before with Dr. Forsyth. Had he been the last to see him alive, Miss Marple finished another row of stitches before setting her knitting down. "Mr. Marsh," she said lightly, "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity." Len glanced up warily. "About what?" "You knew Dr. Forsyth before he arrived in St. Mary Mead, didn't you?" Len exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Not personally, but I knew of him. Anyone in my line of work did." "You mentioned something about him stealing something." Len hesitated. "A manuscript," he admitted at last. "A very rare one. It belonged to a private collection, Digby's up in Cambridge. Then one day it vanished." Miss Marple nodded. "And you believed Dr. Forsyth had taken it?" Len swirled his drink. "It wasn't just belief, Mrs. Marple. I had proof." A hush fell over the room as Edith, still wiping the bar, paused mid-motion. Greaves, who had been sitting nearby, leaned forward. "You've got evidence of this?" Len hesitated, but Miss Marple's sharp gaze didn't waver. He sighed. "I saw him with it once, years ago, the Digby manuscript. I confronted him about it, but he denied everything. Then suddenly he disappeared. I'd given up on ever seeing it again, until he turned up here." Miss Marple frowned. "And yet the manuscript is nowhere to be found." "No," Len admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "And that's the strangest part. The search of Dr. Forsyth's room had yielded little of note. His satchel contained some letters, notes on archaeology, but nothing incriminating. His clothes remained neatly folded in his trunk. There was no sign of the missing manuscript." Miss Marple, however, was not one to be easily discouraged. She stepped into the room once more, gazing at the simple furnishings, a desk, a chair, an unmade bed, and, of course, the wardrobe. She opened it, running a hand along the inside. A wardrobe, she reflected, was often an afterthought, a place to store things away from prying eyes. But something about this one felt off. Reaching up, she tapped against the wooden back panel. A hollow sound. How very interesting. With careful fingers, she pressed along the edges. The panel shifted slightly, revealing a narrow cavity. And inside it, a stack of papers, folded neatly. Miss Marple retrieved them, her fingers brushing across the aged parchment, the Digby manuscript. Inspector Greaves had been pacing the inn's common room when Miss Marple returned, the manuscript in hand. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, eyebrows lifting. "What's that?" She handed it to him without ceremony. "Dr. Forsyth's missing manuscript." Greaves took the pages, flipping through them with a frown. "And where, may I ask, did you find this?" Miss Marple smiled demurely. "Hidden in the back of his wardrobe. Quite a clever place, really. He must have known someone might come looking for it." Len swore under his breath. "So he did have it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But the real question, Inspector, is who knew he had it?" Greaves scowled. "That's what I intend to find out." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple found herself speaking once more with Edith. The landlady had seemed particularly uneasy since the discovery of the body. Miss Marple, ever gentle in her approach, decided to see what could be learned. "You must have seen many visitors come through this inn over the years," Miss Marple mused, sipping her tea. Edith gave a weak smile. More than I can count. Yet, Miss Marple continued, Dr. Forsyth was different, wasn't he? Edith's hand stilled. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple tilted her head. You heard something the night he vanished, didn't you? Edith's face paled. I don't know. My dear, you are not a woman easily frightened, Miss Marple said kindly, but something has shaken you. Edith swallowed. I heard him moving about late at night, papers rustling, and then something burning. Burning? Edith nodded. It sounded like paper being burned in the fireplace. I thought it odd, but I didn't want to pry. Miss Marple considered this. If Dr. Forsyth had been burning something, it likely meant he was trying to destroy evidence. But what? More importantly, did someone interrupt him? Edith, Miss Marple said gently. Did anyone else come to the inn that night? Anyone unusual? Edith hesitated, then shook her head. Not that I saw, not that she saw, which meant it was still possible someone had. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind was abuzz with possibilities. Dr. Forsyth had been murdered. That much was certain. But how? And why? She reviewed what she knew. The door had been locked from the inside. The window was undisturbed. The manuscript had been hidden away. Perhaps Forsyth feared someone would take it. He had been burning something that night. Possibly something related to the manuscript. His cane was missing. It was that last detail that nagged at her. A man of Forsyth's age and frailty would never have gone anywhere without his cane, yet it was nowhere to be found. A clever trick, Miss Marple thought. Removing the cane made it seem as though he had left of his own volition. But what if he hadn't left at all? A shiver ran down her spine. If Dr. Forsyth had truly been in that room until the last moment, then that meant someone had been inside with him. And if that were true, then the murderer had been inside a locked room too. The mystery was only beginning. Chapter 4. A Visitor in the Night. The village of St. Mary Mead had taken on an air of hushed speculation. In the Rosewood Inn, conversations paused as soon as Inspector Greaves or Miss Marple entered a room. Whispers about Dr. Forsyth's murder spread like ripples in a pond. But amidst all the murmurs, one question remained unanswered. How had the man left a locked room, only to be found dead miles away? Miss Marple, seated in her usual spot near the fire, considered everything carefully. The missing cane, the manuscript, the burning of papers in the dead of night. She had seen too many mysteries in her lifetime to believe in impossible vanishings. There was always an explanation. One simply had to be patient enough to uncover it. Her thoughts were interrupted when Edith Cavendish appeared at her side, hesitating. "Mrs. Marple," she murmured, glancing around nervously. "Might I have a word?" Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly and looked up with an encouraging smile. "Of course, my dear." Edith took a deep breath, her hands twisting together. "There was something I didn't mention before," she admitted in a hushed voice. "I didn't think it was important, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her blue eyes sharpened. "Go on." Edith glanced towards the staircase, as if expecting to see someone eavesdropping. I heard footsteps outside Forsyth's door that night." Miss Marple sat forward slightly. "What time was this?" "Around midnight," Edith whispered. "I was coming up to check the lamps when I heard it. Someone moving softly just outside his door." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you see anyone?" Edith hesitated, biting her lip. "No. By the time I reached the hallway, it was empty. But I had the strangest feeling, Mrs. Marple, as if someone had just slipped away before I arrived." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her knitting needles. "A visitor in the night, lingering outside a locked door. And then, only hours later, Dr. Forsyth had vanished, only to be found dead." "Thank you, Edith," she said warmly. "That is most useful indeed." Later that afternoon, Inspector Greaves stood in the common room, addressing the gathered guests and villagers. His patience was running thin. "Someone in this inn knows more than they're saying," he declared, scanning the faces before him. "Dr. Forsyth was murdered, and I mean to find out who's responsible. Now," he turned sharply towards Len Marsh, "you had a quarrel with him the night he disappeared, did you not?" Len stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I wouldn't call it a quarrel, more of a discussion." "You accused him of stealing a manuscript," Greaves pressed. "Did you threaten him?" Len's hands curled into fists. "Of course not. I wanted the truth, that's all. And look here, Inspector, if I wanted the manuscript, don't you think I'd have taken it when I had the chance?" Greaves eyed him. "Where were you around midnight?" Len scoffed. "In my room. Ask Edith. I went up early." Miss Marple observed the exchange with great interest. She believed Len Marsh had been angry with Forsyth, perhaps even hated him. But she did not believe he was the murderer. His temper was too hot, his manner too direct. Murder, especially one as elaborate as this, required patience and cunning. No, someone else had planned this, and planned it well. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage reviewing the facts. She had spent years unpicking tangled mysteries, and this one was proving particularly knotty. The key questions remained. How had Dr. Forsyth left the locked room? Why had his cane disappeared? Who had been lurking outside his door at midnight? She closed her eyes, letting her mind wander through the puzzle. And then a thought struck her. Had Forsyth left the room at all? She sat bolt upright. The assumption had always been that Forsyth had somehow escaped. But what if he hadn't? What if instead someone had entered? Her mind whirred. Someone had entered Forsyth's room, perhaps using a second key, perhaps in some other manner. But how had they killed him? And then Miss Marple's lips pressed together. There was one possibility, one rather grim possibility. She would need to see the body again. The following morning, she paid a visit to the village morgue. Inspector Greaves, though sceptical, allowed her a brief examination under his supervision. Dr. Forsyth lay cold and still, his spectacles carefully placed beside him. But Miss Marple was not looking at his face. She was studying his hands. A moment later, she exhaled softly. There, beneath his nails, a faint trace of what looked like fibres, fabric perhaps, or something else. She turned to Greaves. "Inspector, might I ask, was there any sign that Dr. Forsyth struggled before his death?" Greaves frowned. "No real bruising, no obvious Wounds, likely heart failure or poisoning, though we've found no trace of poison yet. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her handbag. No, I rather think it was something else. Greaves gave her a sharp look. What do you mean? Miss Marple straightened. I believe Dr. Forsyth was smothered. Greaves blinked. Smothered? Miss Marple nodded. Most likely with a pillow or heavy cloth. It would explain why there were no wounds. And if I'm not mistaken, he fought back, however weakly. Greaves cursed under his breath. You think he was murdered? In his room, before the door was locked? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Yes, and then the murderer had to remove his body without unlocking the door. Greaves rubbed a hand over his face. That would mean... Yes, Miss Marple said gently. The answer to how Forsyth vanished is simple, really. He never left that room at all, until after he was dead. Greaves stared at her. But then how... Miss Marple turned towards the door. We must return to the inn, Inspector. I believe we are getting quite close to the truth. That evening, back at the Rosewood Inn, Miss Marple quietly observed the guests. Len Marsh was drinking, his brow furrowed. Edith was tense, her hands trembling as she served customers. And then there was George Cavendish, the innkeeper. Silent, watchful, yes, things were beginning to come together. Miss Marple smiled, lifting her teacup. The murderer had been inside that room, and now she knew exactly how they had done it. But there was one final question. Who? She intended to find out. Chapter 5. The Second Key Miss. Marple had always believed that human nature, rather than mere logic, solved crimes. And in this case, the human element was proving more revealing than the so-called locked-room mystery itself. By the following morning, the Rosewood Inn was steeped in tension. Inspector Greaves had taken a firmer hand in questioning the guests, and whispers of suspicion grew with each passing hour. But Miss Marple was thinking of something else entirely, something practical. If Dr. Forsyth had been smothered in his room, the murderer had been inside. That was certain. But then they had to leave, and the door had been locked, which meant either a duplicate key had been used or... Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. There was another way, wasn't there? But before she could pursue that thought, Edith Cavendish approached her table, her expression troubled. Mrs. Marple, Edith murmured, casting a wary glance towards her husband George, who stood behind the bar. I have something to tell you. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Of course, my dear, sit down. Edith hesitated, her hands trembling. I should have mentioned this earlier, but I was frightened. Miss Marple's blue eyes remained kind, but firm. Take your time, dear. Tell me everything. Edith swallowed hard. It's about the spare key to Dr. Forsyth's room. A hush seemed to fall over the room. Miss Marple's fingers tightened, just slightly in her lap. You had a spare. Edith nodded miserably. We always keep one for emergencies. But when the inspector asked, I couldn't find it. I thought I'd misplaced it, but now... Her voice dropped to a whisper. Now I think it was stolen. Miss Marple's mind raced. A stolen key. That changed everything. Who knew about the key, Edith? She asked gently. Edith's face paled. Only George and myself, and perhaps... She hesitated. Perhaps Len Marsh. He's been coming. Here for years. He knows how we run things. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you tell the inspector?" Edith shook her head. "No, I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean." Miss Marple patted Edith's hand gently. "Then let us find out." By late afternoon, Miss Marple had taken it upon herself to search the inn for something everyone else had overlooked. The missing key. She had a suspicion that the murderer would not have discarded it immediately. That would have been too careless. Instead, it was likely hidden somewhere safe, somewhere close. Her first stop was the small storeroom under the stairs, where supplies were kept. The room was cramped, dimly lit, and smelled of old wood and ale. She carefully checked the shelves, brushing her fingers lightly over each surface. Nothing. Then she turned to the fireplace in the common room. Had the key been thrown into the ashes? She poked at the soot carefully with the end of her knitting needle. But no, there was nothing there either. She frowned. If she were the murderer, where would she hide it? And then her eyes landed on something. The old grandfather clock in the corner. She stepped forward, pressing a hand against the wooden frame. A fine layer of dust coated most of it, except for one spot, near the base, where there was a faint smudge, as if someone had touched it recently. With careful fingers, she reached inside the base of the clock, and there, cold and unmistakable, was a small brass key. She withdrew it slowly, turning it over in her palm, the missing key to Forsyth's room. Miss Marple wasted no time in summoning Inspector Greaves. "Well?" he asked gruffly, as she handed him the key. "I believe this is the spare key to Dr. Forsyth's room," Miss Marple said mildly. "And I believe it was hidden deliberately by the murderer." Greaves examined it with narrowed eyes. "Where did you find it?" "In the grandfather clock," Miss Marple said simply. Greaves exhaled sharply. "Clever, very clever. So, someone used it to get into Forsyth's room that night. But who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, Inspector, is the next question. We must answer." Greaves rubbed his jaw. "I'll have a word with George Cavendish. If he and his wife were the only ones with access to the key, then—" Miss Marple lifted a hand delicately. "Ah, but you forget, someone stole it, which means it was not necessarily George or Edith who used it." Greaves frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps the person who was seen lurking outside Forsyth's room at midnight." Greaves's eyes darkened. "You mean Len Marsh?" Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Or someone who wanted us to think it was Len Marsh." That evening, Miss Marple quietly observed the inn's guests once more. Len Marsh sat with his arms crossed, muttering to himself. He had been angry when accused, but not panicked. That was something. Edith, though nervous, seemed relieved that the missing key had been found. George Cavendish, however, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The innkeeper was quieter than usual. He had barely spoken all evening, and when Greaves had questioned him earlier, he had answered too quickly, too smoothly. And then there was his alibi. George had claimed he was asleep that night, but Edith had never confirmed it. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. She would have to be very careful now. The murderer had planned this crime meticulously. And soon, very soon, they would realize they had made a mistake, a very crucial mistake. Chapter 6. The Man Who Knew Too Much Tension Lay Thick in the Air at the Rosewood Inn. With the discovery of the missing key, the investigation had taken a decisive turn. Miss Marple knew that the murderer had taken great care in executing this crime. But no matter how carefully one planned, human nature always betrayed itself in the end. She sat in the common room, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the guests. The key had been hidden inside the grandfather clock. A clever choice, but not clever enough. The real question was, who had put it there? Inspector Greaves had already called George Cavendish for another round of questioning. The innkeeper arrived at the inspector's table wiping his hands on his apron. Though he tried to appear composed, Miss Marple noted how he avoided looking directly at the inspector. "Now then, Cavendish," Greaves said gruffly, "you and your wife were the only ones with access to the spare key. When did you last see it before it went missing?" George scratched the back of his neck. "Can't say exactly. I don't handle the keys much. That's more Edith's job." Greaves narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying you never noticed it was gone?" George hesitated. I suppose I must have assumed Edith had it." Miss Marple, watching closely, did not miss the way George's fingers twitched slightly. A sign of nervousness, a guilty conscience, or merely fear of being falsely accused. Greaves leaned forward. "Tell me, Cavendish, where were you around midnight the night Dr. Forsyth disappeared?" George straightened slightly. "In bed, of course." Greaves glanced at Edith, who had been listening nearby, wringing her hands. "Mrs. Cavendish, can you confirm that?" Edith hesitated, her eyes darting to her husband. I think so." Greaves frowned. "Think so. Either he was there or he wasn't." Edith swallowed. "I went to bed earlier than George. I don't know when he came up." Greaves turned sharply to George. "Well?" George's face reddened. "I stayed downstairs a while, locking up." Miss Marple's knitting slowed. That was a curious choice of words. He hadn't said he was alone. She decided to probe further. "George, my dear," she said kindly, "did you hear anything unusual that night? Any sounds in the corridor?" George shook his head quickly. "No, nothing at all." Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, but Edith didn't she?" George's lips parted slightly. For just a fraction of a second, his face betrayed something. Surprise? Alarm? Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. She heard footsteps outside Dr. Forsyth's door around midnight. George licked his lips. I wouldn't know anything about that." Miss Marple tilted her head. "No, but surely, if you were downstairs, as you say, you might have noticed someone moving about." Greaves eyed George sharply. "That's a fair point." George's hands clenched. "I was only downstairs for a short while. Then I went to bed." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Greaves. The innkeeper was nervous. Too nervous, and yet Miss Marple was not certain George Cavendish was the murderer. He was hiding something, yes, but something different. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village, deep in thought. She had learned long ago that stepping away from a problem often helped the mind see it more clearly. If George Cavendish was lying about his whereabouts, then why? Was it to protect himself, or someone else? As she passed by the village post office, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside, Len Marsh. He was pacing, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, his brow furrowed. In thought, Miss Marple decided it was time for a conversation. She approached with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Marsh." Len looked up, startled. He quickly stubbed out his cigarette. "Oh, afternoon, Mrs. Marple." She studied him for a moment before speaking. "I wonder if I might ask you something." Len sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Go on, then." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. "On the night Dr. Forsyth vanished, you claimed you were in your room all evening. But I wonder, did you perhaps step out, even briefly?" Len tensed. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "Because I suspect you might have seen something. Something you didn't think was important at the time." Len hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "All right. Yes, I did step out, but only for a few minutes, just for some air." Miss Marple nodded. "And during that time, did you notice anyone in the corridor?" Len frowned. "Now that you mention it, yeah." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. "Who did you see?" Len's jaw clenched. "I saw George Cavendish." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Outside Dr. Forsyth's room?" Len shook his head. "No, he was downstairs, in the common room. He looked nervous, kept glancing at the clock." Miss Marple considered this. George Cavendish had claimed he was locking up. But if he had been nervous, glancing at the clock, then what had he been waiting for? That evening, back at the inn, Miss Marple quietly observed George Cavendish as he served drinks. His movements were precise, careful, but there was something else, something in the way he avoided certain gazes. She leaned toward Edith, who stood nearby. "Tell me, my dear," she said gently, "did your husband know Dr. Forsyth well?" Edith hesitated. "Not particularly, but—" She bit her lip. "But?" Miss Marple prompted. Edith looked down. There was something odd a few weeks ago. George received a letter. After he read it, he seemed troubled. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Do you still have it?" Edith shook her head. "No, he burned it." Miss Marple's lips pressed. "Together. That was interesting, very interesting." She watched as George turned away, retreating towards the back of the inn. Miss Marple made her decision. It was time to have a quiet word with George Cavendish, because whatever secret he was hiding, it might just unlock the entire mystery. Chapter 7. A Conversation in the Dark. The evening at the Rosewood Inn settled into a tense quiet, the kind that suggested everyone was waiting for something, though none could say what. Miss Marple, however, knew precisely what she was waiting for. George Cavendish was hiding something, and she meant to find out what. As the last of the guests retired for the night, Miss Marple waited patiently in the common room, her knitting needles moving methodically. Every so often she glanced toward the door leading to the back of the inn. At precisely 10:30, George emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He hesitated upon seeing her. "Mrs. Marple, you're up late." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, I often find my mind is clearest in the evening. Would you mind sitting with me for a moment?" George shifted uncomfortably but nodded, settling into a chair across from her. His broad hands, so steady when pouring drinks, fidgeted slightly against his trousers. Miss Marple placed her knitting on her lap and studied him. It must be quite a burden, running an inn like this. So many people, so many troubles. George forced a chuckle. It's a business like any other. She nodded. And yet you seem particularly troubled these last few days. It wouldn't happen to have anything to do with Dr. Forsyth's unfortunate demise, would it? His face stiffened. I've already told the inspector everything I know. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But that's not quite the same as telling everything, is it? George's gaze flickered. He started to speak but stopped himself. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice gentle but firm. Len Marsh saw you that night, downstairs, looking at the clock. George's fingers gripped the rag more tightly. So, what if he did? Were you waiting for something? She asked softly. Or someone? For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a low, weary voice, he exhaled, I was waiting for Forsyth. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her pulse quickened. You had an appointment with him. George hesitated, then nodded. He sent me a note, said he needed to speak with me urgently. Miss Marple tilted her head. About what? George swallowed hard. I don't know. Miss Marple arched a delicate brow. George ran a hand over his face. I swear, I don't. He just wrote that it was a matter of importance, and to meet him in the common room at midnight. I thought maybe it was about something to do with the inn. He used to stay here often, you see. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. A meeting at midnight. That changed things. Did he ever arrive? She asked. George shook his head. No. I waited, but he never came. Miss Marple sat back thoughtfully. If Forsyth had planned to meet George but had never arrived, then something had happened before that meeting could take place, which meant he had been killed earlier than suspected. Miss Marple found Inspector Greaves early the next morning. He was standing by the front entrance of the inn, talking with one of his constables. She approached him briskly. Inspector, I believe Dr. Forsyth's time of death must be reconsidered. Greaves frowned. And what makes you say that, Mrs. Marple? She explained George Cavendish's admission. Greaves listened carefully, arms folded. When she finished, he exhaled sharply. So Forsyth had planned to meet Cavendish at midnight, but never showed. He rubbed his chin. That means he must have been dead before then. Miss Marple nodded. Which means we must rethink certain alibis, mustn't we? Greaves grunted. A good point. Some of these folks claim to have been in bed when the murder took place. But if the murder happened earlier than we assumed, well... Miss Marple smiled. Precisely. Greaves straightened. I'll have another word with our suspects. But Miss Marple had another idea. There was still one thing she needed to confirm. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in quiet observation. She watched Len Marsh, who had grown more restless. She noticed Edith Cavendish watching her husband with unease, and she paid particular attention to Caroline Forsyth, the victim's niece, who had grown quieter than usual. It was late afternoon when she decided to test a theory. She found Caroline sitting by the window in the lounge, staring absently at the grey sky outside. Miss Marple sat down beside her, folding her hands neatly. My dear, I wonder if I might ask you something. Caroline turned, startled. Of course, Mrs. Marple. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. You were quite close to your uncle, weren't you? Caroline hesitated. Yes, I suppose I was, Miss Marple nodded. And you knew his habits well? Caroline's lips pressed together. I think so. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Did he ever mention having important business here? A matter so urgent that he would ask someone to meet him at midnight? Caroline's face paled. No. Why? Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. Because he did. Caroline looked down at her hands, twisting them together. I don't know anything about that. Miss Marple let the silence linger before she spoke again. He never mentioned a letter. Caroline's head jerked up. Ah! Miss Marple's voice remained soft. You did know about the letter, didn't you? Caroline hesitated. Then, with a defeated sigh, she nodded. Yes, he mentioned it to me. Miss Marple tilted her head. And what did he say? Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. He said he was worried, that he had discovered something that frightened him. Miss Marple's breath caught. And did he say what it was? Caroline shook her head. No, just that it was something from the past that had come back to haunt him. Miss Marple's mind whirled. A secret from the past. Something Forsyth had uncovered. Something dangerous enough to get him killed. She patted Caroline's hand reassuringly. Thank you, my dear. That was most helpful. Caroline bit her lip. Mrs. Marple, do you think his murder had something to do with that secret? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think, my dear, that it had everything to do with it. As night fell once again over the Rosewood Inn, Miss Marple sat quietly in her room, going over everything she had learned, a stolen key, a midnight meeting that never happened, a secret from the past, and someone in this very inn, who had gone to great lengths to keep that secret buried. But they had made a mistake, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 8. The Ghost of the Past. Miss Marple rose early, her mind sharp with purpose. Dr. Forsyth's cryptic words about a past secret had taken root in her thoughts overnight. The past had a way of creeping into the present, especially when someone had something to hide. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, well, were often the cause of murder. She made her way downstairs to the dining area, where the other guests were beginning their breakfasts. The atmosphere at the Rosewood Inn had grown tense. Conversations were hushed, glances were cautious. The shadow of Forsyth's death lingered over them all. Inspector Greaves was already present, speaking in low tones with one of his constables. He glanced up as Miss Marple approached. "Ah, Mrs. Marple," he said, rubbing his chin. "I trust you're well this morning?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Quite well, Inspector. I do find a good night's sleep clarifies one's thoughts." Greaves snorted. "I'd hardly call it a good night. Not with the whole blasted inn on edge." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've been reconsidering our timeline, as you suggested. If Forsyth was murdered earlier than we first thought, then it changes the suspect's alibis considerably." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Inspector. And more importantly, it makes his last known actions even more significant." Greaves gestured for her to follow him to a quieter corner. "You believe his past was the key to this, don't you?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Yes, But the question is, which part of his past? And why now? Greaves sighed. We know he arrived here in good spirits, or so Cavendish claimed. Then suddenly he's dead in a locked room. Something happened in the time between his arrival and his murder. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, and I believe I know how to find out what. Greaves raised an eyebrow. Oh? Miss Marple's smile widened. We must look into the last thing Dr. Forsyth wrote. A short while later, Miss Marple approached Caroline Forsyth, who sat by the fireplace, a book open but unread in her lap. Miss Forsyth, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if you might help me with something. Caroline looked up, startled. Oh, yes, of course. Miss Marple sat beside her. Your uncle was a meticulous man, wasn't he? He was the sort to write things down. Caroline frowned. Yes, I suppose. He was. He always kept notes on his medical cases. Miss Marple nodded. Did he have a notebook with him? Caroline hesitated. I don't know. I didn't think to check his things. Miss Marple patted her hand. Then perhaps we should. With Inspector Greaves overseeing the process, Forsyth's belongings were examined in his locked room. His suitcase remained packed neatly, but on the writing desk, tucked beneath a pile of letters, Miss Marple found a small leather-bound notebook. Greaves flipped it open. Medical notes. Looks like he wrote about his patients. Miss Marple scanned the pages. The entries were methodical, detailing symptoms, treatments, and observations. But then, toward the very end of the notebook, a single entry stood out. It cannot be, after all these years. But I know what I saw. I must confront them. Greaves frowned. No name, no details. Miss Marple tapped the page thoughtfully. But this tells us one crucial thing, Inspector. Dr. Forsyth did not merely stumble upon something. He recognized it. He knew the significance of whatever he saw. Greaves' face darkened. And someone wanted to make sure he never spoke about it. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently. Indeed. The morning wore on, and Miss Marple watched the guests carefully. She saw George Cavendish's eyes dart nervously toward the inspector. She observed how Edith Cavendish seemed desperate to avoid conversation. Len Marsh paced near the window, his usual bravado subdued, but it was Caroline who troubled Miss Marple the most. The young woman had grown increasingly withdrawn since their conversation the day before. At midday, Miss Marple found her standing near the garden wall, staring blankly into the distance. My dear, Miss Marple said kindly, I know this has all been very difficult for you. Caroline turned, forcing a weak smile. It's just, I keep thinking, if Uncle knew something dangerous, why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me? Miss Marple hesitated before replying. Perhaps he thought he had more time. Or perhaps. She trailed off meaningfully. Caroline's brow furrowed. What? Miss Marple spoke carefully. Perhaps he was afraid that telling you would put you in danger too. Caroline paled. Miss Marple studied her closely. Tell me, my dear, was there ever a time when your uncle spoke of something from his past that troubled him? Perhaps something he never quite explained? Caroline bit her lip, thinking. Then, slowly, she nodded. There was something. A few years ago, he mentioned an old patient. He said he had once made a mistake, a terrible mistake, But he never told me what it was. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A mistake? Caroline nodded. He said he had misdiagnosed someone, that it had ruined their life. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And do you know the name of this patient? Caroline shook her head. No, he refused to tell me. Miss Marple pressed a gentle hand to Caroline's arm. My dear, I believe that patient may very well be here, and I fear your uncle recognized them before it was too late. Caroline's breath hitched. You mean they killed him? Miss Marple's voice was firm. I believe so. By the time evening fell, Miss Marple had drawn her conclusions. The past had returned in the form of an old grudge. As she sat in the common room once more, she watched the suspects, each of them weighed down by their own burdens. But one of them, she knew, carried the heaviest burden of all, the burden of guilt. Tomorrow she would have her answer, and the murderer would have nowhere left to hide. Chapter 9. A Name from the Past. The next morning Miss Marple wasted no time. The discovery of Dr. Forsyth's cryptic notebook entry and Caroline's revelation about a misdiagnosed patient had set her on a clear path. Someone at the Rosewood Inn had suffered at Forsyth's hands long ago, and now they had silenced him forever. But who? Miss Marple sat at breakfast, her teacup steady in her hand. Around her the guests were subdued, each lost in their own thoughts. She observed them carefully. George Cavendish, the innkeeper, looked weary, his hands gripping, his coffee cup a little too tightly. Edith Cavendish, his wife, sat stiffly beside him, her eyes darting between the inspector and her husband. Len Marsh, the travelling salesman, tapped his fingers anxiously against the table, as if itching to leave. Caroline Forsyth, grieving, but alert, sat quietly, lost in thought. And then there was Inspector Greaves, who, unlike the others, did not look troubled. He looked determined. I've taken a closer look at Dr. Forsyth's records, Greaves announced, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence. And it seems our dear doctor was not without his faults. Miss Marple smiled approvingly. Quite right, Inspector. A man of his profession must have encountered many difficulties. But I wonder, did you find anything about a particular patient? One he might have wronged? Greaves grunted. Nothing concrete, but I did find a lawsuit filed against him about 15 years ago. A patient claimed he had been misdiagnosed, left permanently impaired. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. And the patient's name? Greaves flipped through his notes. A man called Samuel Grayson. A sudden silence fell over the room. Miss Marple did not miss the way Len Marsh tensed at the name. She turned toward him gently. Mr. Marsh, you look rather unwell. Marsh cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Just a bit of a shock. I knew a Sam Grayson once. Years ago, Miss Marple nodded. Indeed? And what became of him? Marsh hesitated. Lost touch. It was a long time ago. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yes, I imagine it would be, wouldn't it? She set her knitting down. And yet it is interesting, because Dr. Forsyth's note suggested that he saw something or someone that made him realize his past mistake had caught up with him. Marsh swallowed hard. Now look here, are you suggesting Miss Marple held up a hand. "I am only suggesting that if Samuel Grayson were still alive, he might have had reason to bear a grudge. A terrible grudge." Marsh shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his fork. "I don't know what you're getting at." Miss Marple sighed lightly. "Oh, my dear man, I do believe you do. You see, I have been thinking about you quite a lot. You came to this inn under the guise of a traveller, but you seem more familiar with the place than one might expect. You claim to be a salesman, yet your business here appears rather vague. And most curiously, you reacted quite strongly to the name Samuel Grayson." Marsh's face had gone pale. "That's nonsense." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Is it? I wonder." Greaves narrowed his eyes. "Mrs. Marple, are you suggesting—" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I am suggesting, Inspector, that perhaps Len Marsh is not his real name at all." The room fell deathly silent. Marsh clenched his fists, his voice unsteady. "That's ridiculous. Miss Marple studied him with sharp eyes. "Dr. Forsyth saw you, didn't he? And in that moment he recognized you. He remembered what he had done to you all those years ago, and that is why he wrote that entry in his notebook." Marsh's breathing grew ragged. His eyes darted to Greaves, then to the door, as if calculating an escape. Greaves straightened. "Is this true, Marsh? Are you Samuel Grayson?" Marsh let out a bitter laugh. "It doesn't matter now, does it?" He looked down at his hands. "Not after what I've done." Miss Marple remained calm. "Then you admit it?" Marsh exhaled heavily. "Yes." He leaned back, rubbing his face. "It's true. Forsyth ruined my life. He misdiagnosed me when I was young, said my condition was something harmless. But he was wrong. By the time I got the right diagnosis, it was too late. My health was ruined, my career gone. I lost everything." Caroline gasped. "But why kill him now?" Marsh's jaw tightened. "I never thought I'd see him again. But when I arrived at this inn and saw him here—" He shook his head. "I couldn't believe it. The man who destroyed my life was sitting there, smiling, drinking his tea, as if nothing had ever happened." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And you couldn't let that stand." Marsh let out a bitter laugh. "He recognized me, you know. I saw it in his eyes, and I knew he'd figure it out. So that night I slipped into his room while he was still getting ready for bed. He was writing in that blasted notebook when he looked up and saw me." His voice faltered. Greaves folded his arms. "And then?" Marsh sighed, shaking his head. "He tried to talk, tried to explain, said he was sorry, but sorry wouldn't bring back the years I lost." His hands trembled, so I grabbed the lamp from his desk and silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She had known, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud carried a weight of finality. Greaves nodded to his constable. "Take him into custody." The constable stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Marsh's shoulder. He didn't resist. As he was led away, he turned back to Miss Marple. "You really are something, you know that." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I only pay attention, Mr. Grayson, and the past always has a way of catching up. The tension in—" The Rosewood Inn lifted slightly after Marsh Grayson was taken away. George Cavendish let out a long breath. "Well, that's that then." Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "Perhaps. But even in resolution, there are always things left unsaid. Edith Cavendish stiffened. "What do you mean, Mrs. Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was polite but unwavering. "Simply that this mystery has been resolved, but that does not mean all secrets have been uncovered." She glanced toward Caroline Forsyth, who sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. The case of Dr. Forsyth's murder was closed, but Miss Marple suspected that some mysteries, even when solved, left behind unanswered questions, and those, she knew, could be the most dangerous of all. Chapter 10. Shadows That Remain. The next morning, the air inside the Rosewood Inn was lighter, but not by much. Len Marsh, Samuel Grayson, had been taken into custody the previous evening, and Inspector Greaves had officially closed the case. Dr. Forsyth's murder had been solved. And yet Miss Marple was troubled. She sat at her usual spot in the sitting room, knitting in hand, watching as the remaining guests went about their morning. George Cavendish was attempting to act normal, bustling about, though he looked exhausted. Edith Cavendish remained stiff and cold, barely speaking. Caroline Forsyth, though outwardly composed, had the distant look of a woman whose thoughts were heavy with something unsaid. Miss Marple had been solving mysteries for many years, and if there was one thing she had learned, it was that even when the culprit was caught, there were often deeper truths left uncovered. Inspector Greaves appeared in the doorway, looking mildly surprised to see Miss Marple still seated. "I thought you'd have packed your things by now, Mrs. Marple," he said, strolling over. She smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I do intend to leave. Soon, Inspector. But one shouldn't rush these things." Greaves grunted, taking a seat opposite her. "It's over. Marsh Grayson confessed. The evidence all checks out, and Forsyth's murder is explained." He studied her. "And yet, I have the distinct impression you're not quite satisfied." Miss Marple gave a little chuckle. "Oh, Inspector, you do have good instincts. It is not that I question the culprit. No, that is quite clear. But I do believe there is more to this than what has been admitted." Greaves frowned. "You mean someone else was involved?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Not directly, perhaps. But the human heart is a complex thing, Inspector. I wonder, have you considered that Dr. Forsyth's arrival here was not a mere coincidence?" Greaves leaned forward. "Go on." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "Dr. Forsyth came here with purpose. He had written in his notebook that he recognized something or someone from his past. But why was he here at all? Why did he choose this inn, in this particular village, at this particular time?" Greaves sighed. "You think he was looking for something?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Or someone." Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself taking a quiet stroll in the garden. Caroline Forsyth stood near the stone wall, staring absently at the flowers. "You must be relieved," Miss Marple said gently. Caroline turned, startled. "Oh, I suppose so." Miss Marple studied her closely. "My dear, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I wonder, did your uncle ever mention coming here before?" Caroline hesitated. "No, at least not that I recall." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet he arrived with such certainty, as if he had unfinished business." Caroline bit her lip. I don't know. Maybe he did, but he never told me." Miss Marple's voice remained light. "He did tell you one thing, though, didn't he? That he had once made a terrible mistake, and he never forgave himself for it." Caroline's expression flickered. "Yes." Miss Marple took a step closer. "And yet I cannot help but wonder, my dear, was the mistake truly about Samuel Grayson? Or was there something else?" Caroline's hands clenched at her sides. Miss Marple spoke softly. "I believe your uncle came here to find someone from his past, perhaps even to make amends. But before he could do so, he was killed." Caroline's breath hitched. Why are you telling me this?" Miss Marple sighed. "Because I believe he was here for you." Caroline's face drained of colour. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Did you ever wonder why your uncle suddenly took you in all those years ago? Why, after living a life without much family, he chose to bring you into his home?" Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. "He always said I was the daughter of an old friend." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that is what he told you, but I rather think the truth is different." Caroline's eyes widened. Miss Marple continued, "I believe Dr. Forsyth was more than just a guardian to you. I believe you were his daughter." A stunned silence stretched between them. Caroline took a step back. "No, that's not. He never said." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "No, my dear, he wouldn't. But I believe he knew, and I believe that knowledge weighed on him for years. Perhaps he had once abandoned your mother, or perhaps he had made some other decision he regretted. But something brought him here. Something made him want to tell you the truth." Caroline's lip trembled. "And now I'll never know." Marple reached for her hand. "I believe you already do, my dear." A tear slipped down Caroline's cheek. That evening, Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the sitting-room, sipping her tea. The case of Dr. Forsyth's murder had been solved, but what truly mattered was the human story left behind. Inspector Greaves approached her, arms folded. "So, you're leaving in the morning?" Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Inspector. I do think my work here is done." Greaves shook his head. "You're something else, Mrs. Marple. I thought I was good at this job, but you see things I never even think to look for." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, Inspector, you do quite well. But I have the advantage of age and observation, and people, you see, are not so very different from one another. Their motives, their regrets, their fears, they all leave traces." Greaves nodded. "And what trace has this case left on you?" Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That even when a mystery is solved, the real truths, the ones that matter, are often much quieter. And sometimes the most important secrets are not the ones that cause a murder, but the ones that remain after." Greaves gave her a long look before shaking his head with a wry smile. "I don't suppose I'll ever quite get used to the way you think, Mrs. Marple." Miss Marple laughed lightly. "Oh, I do hope not, Inspector. It wouldn't be nearly as much fun." And with that, she set her cup down, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and gazed out the window as the evening settled over the quiet little inn, the shadows of the past finally at rest. Chapter 11. The Farewell. That wasn't the following morning, The Rosewood Inn was quieter than it had been in days. The tension that had clung to its walls had not entirely lifted, but the weight of murder and secrets had begun to settle. Miss Marple, ever punctual, had packed her belongings and was finishing her breakfast when George Cavendish approached her. "You'll be leaving us today, Mrs. Marple?" he asked, attempting a smile. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "Yes, Mr. Cavendish. I do believe I have done all I can here." George hesitated. "I must say, I'm glad the whole business is over. A terrible thing, that murder. A guest dying in one's own establishment. It's not something you forget." Miss Marple gave him a keen look. "No, indeed. And yet I do wonder, Mr. Cavendish, if this incident was quite as unexpected for you as it was for the rest of us." George blinked. "I beg your pardon." Miss Marple smiled gently, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in her eyes. "Oh, I mean no offence, of course. Only that Dr. Forsyth's presence here seemed to unsettle you more than one might expect." George forced a chuckle. "Well, can you blame me? A man gets murdered in my inn. I should think that would unsettle anyone." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so, but I rather think your unease began before the murder, didn't it?" George opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Edith Cavendish spoke from behind him. "That's enough, George," she said quietly. George turned, startled. "Edith?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Ah, Mrs. Cavendish, you have something to add?" Edith folded her hands before her. "It's no use pretending any more. Mrs. Marple sees too much." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "Then perhaps you should tell me what it is I see." Edith took a deep breath. "Dr. Forsyth had been here before, many years ago, and we had hoped he would never come back." George exhaled sharply. "Edith, don't!" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Go on." Edith met her gaze. 15 years ago, Dr. Forsyth came to this inn on business, though we didn't know it at the time. He was looking for someone." She paused. "A woman." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady motion. "A woman?" Edith nodded. "Her name was Margaret, and she was a housemaid here. A young girl, no more than 20. She had come from London to start a new life. She was quiet, kind, but always had a sadness about her." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though she already suspected what was coming. George sighed heavily. Forsyth was looking for her because of what he had done. Edith nodded grimly. Margaret was carrying his child. A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And what became of her?" Edith's eyes clouded. "She disappeared. One night, just after Forsyth left, she vanished. No note, no word. We searched, but there was nothing." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "You believed she ran away?" Edith swallowed. "We hoped she had." George's voice was barely above, a whisper, but we never knew for sure. Miss Marple let the silence stretch before speaking again. "And you were afraid that Dr. Forsyth had returned to find out what happened to her?" Edith nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple sighed. "Which means, of course, that you must have known, or at least suspected, that Margaret never left of her own accord." George's shoulders sagged. "We feared the worst, but without proof, what could we do?" Miss Marple considered this. "And when Forsyth was murdered, you thought—" "What?" That someone was still trying to keep that secret buried? Edith shook her head. We didn't know what to think. We only knew that his return meant something unfinished had come back to haunt us. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place, though one thing still eluded her. What did Margaret look like? She asked suddenly. Edith hesitated. She was fair-haired, small, and had the most striking blue eyes. Miss Marple smiled gently. Ah, I thought as much. George frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Why, Mr. Cavendish, I believe I know precisely where Margaret is. Later that afternoon, Caroline Forsyth stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the rolling hills beyond the inn. She had barely spoken since her conversation with Miss Marple the previous day. She turned as Miss Marple approached. You know, my dear, Miss Marple said, I was just speaking with the Cavendishes about a young woman who once lived here, a housemaid, a girl with fair hair and striking blue eyes. Caroline's throat tightened. What are you saying? Miss Marple's voice was kind. I am saying, my dear, that I believe that girl was your mother. Caroline's breath caught. That's not possible. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. I rather think it is. You told me once that your uncle, Dr. Forsyth, took you in when you were very young, that he always said you were the daughter of an old friend. But he never spoke of your mother, did he? Caroline shook her head. Miss Marple continued, I believe Margaret never left this village, and I believe she did not vanish, but that something happened to her. Caroline's hands clenched into fists. And no one ever told me. Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps they thought they were protecting you, or perhaps they were afraid of what you might find. Caroline turned away, struggling to compose herself. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. I believe your uncle came here because he had finally found out the truth. He wanted to tell you, to give you answers. Caroline wiped at her eyes. And now he's gone. Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on her arm. But the truth remains, my dear, and you have every right to seek it. Caroline swallowed hard, then nodded. I want to know. Miss Marple smiled. Then, my dear, let us begin. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Miss Marple made her final preparations to leave the Rosewood Inn. But she knew, deep in her heart, that this mystery was not quite over. Dr. Forsyth's murder had been solved, but the truth he had come searching for remained buried. And as she stepped into her carriage, she knew that before this story truly ended, the past would have to be confronted, one final time. Chapter 12. The Truth Unearthed. The air was heavy with unspoken words as Miss Marple sat opposite Caroline Forsyth in the dimly lit drawing-room of the Rosewood Inn. A storm had begun to brew outside, a fitting backdrop to the storm that was about to break within these walls. I've made inquiries, Miss Marple said gently, setting down her knitting. It was not easy, but I believe I have found the last piece of the puzzle. Caroline's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the chair. You mean about my mother? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear, about Margaret. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Caroline's breath hitched. Tell me. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. 15 years ago, Margaret was employed as a housemaid here. By all accounts, she was a quiet but kind girl, well liked by the staff. But she had a secret. She paused, watching Caroline closely. She was expecting a child, and the father of that child was Dr. Forsyth. Caroline's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice low but firm. Dr. Forsyth had abandoned her, or so she believed. He had gone back to his life, his work, leaving her here. But Margaret, my dear, was not the sort to run away. No, she had every intention of staying and raising her child. Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. Then what happened? Miss Marple sighed. She disappeared. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Caroline shivered. You don't think she left? Miss Marple shook her head. No, I do not. Caroline's heart pounded. Then, where is she? The door creaked open slightly, and George Cavendish stepped in. His face was pale, his expression drawn. I think I can answer that. Caroline turned sharply. You knew? George hesitated. I suspected, but I was too much of a coward to say anything. He glanced at Miss Marple. You've figured it out, haven't you? Miss Marple nodded. I believe I have, Mr. Cavendish. Caroline looked between them. Then tell me. George's shoulders sagged. Margaret never left this inn. She never could. Caroline's hands tightened into fists. Then where is she? Miss Marple's voice was quiet but unwavering. Buried. A gasp escaped Caroline's lips. George's throat worked as he forced himself to continue. She died that night, 15 years ago. Caroline stood abruptly. No, that can't be true. George took a shaky breath. She was arguing with someone. I don't know who, but I remember hearing raised voices, and then there was silence. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. And what did you do, Mr. Cavendish? George swallowed hard. I went to check, and I found her. Caroline's breath came in sharp bursts. You found her? Dead? George nodded. She had fallen, or perhaps she had been pushed. I don't know, but she wasn't breathing. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, and instead of alerting the authorities, you hid the body. George shut his eyes. I was scared. Edith, she was the one who convinced me. She said no one would believe it was an accident, that we'd lose the inn, that it would ruin us. Caroline's voice was strangled. So you buried her? Where? George's voice was barely above a whisper. The garden? A deafening silence filled the room. Miss Marple exhaled. I had suspected as much. Caroline stared at him, her expression unreadable. You let me grow up not knowing. You let me believe I was alone. George's eyes shone with regret. We thought we were protecting you. Caroline let out a bitter laugh. Protecting me? You stole my mother from me. Miss Marple reached for her hand, her touch warm. The truth is painful, my dear, but at least now you have it. Caroline's lip trembled. And my uncle, he came here looking for her, didn't he? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, I believe he had finally learned the truth, and someone killed him to keep it buried. Caroline inhaled sharply. You mean you don't think Samuel Grayson was the only one responsible? Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. I believe he killed Dr. Forsyth, but I do not believe he was the only one with something to hide." Caroline turned to George. Who was she arguing with that night? Who was the last person to see her alive? George hesitated. His lips trembled, and then, softly, he whispered, "Edith!" A wave of nausea washed over Caroline. "No," Miss Marple's voice was grave. "I rather suspected as much." George's hands shook. "I never asked. I never wanted to know. But Edith, she was always so adamant that we must keep it quiet, that no one must ever find out. She was the one who told me where to bury the body." Caroline's stomach lurched. "She knew?" George nodded. "She must have. And if she knew, then maybe she was the one who—" The door slammed open. Edith Cavendish stood in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes flashing with something. "Dangerous! You will stop this!" she hissed. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Oh, Mrs. Cavendish, I think we both know that's not possible any more." Edith's lips curled into something resembling a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Miss Marple remained unruffled. "Not clever, my dear, just observant." Edith took a slow step forward. "You don't understand. You don't know what it was like. That girl, she was reckless, desperate. She would have ruined us all." Caroline's voice was like ice. "So you killed her?" Edith's gaze flickered. I didn't mean to." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "But you did." Edith exhaled sharply. She was threatening to go to the police, to tell them everything. She was hysterical. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. And then she slipped. Her voice wavered. "It wasn't supposed to happen." Caroline felt the bile rise in her throat. "And so you covered it up." Edith's expression darkened. "What else could I do?" Miss Marple shook her head. But Mrs. Cavendish, secrets never stay buried forever." For a long moment, Edith said nothing. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out the door. George let out a shaky breath. I suppose we should call the authorities." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I rather think you should." Caroline sat down heavily, her world unravelling. Miss Marple rested a hand on her shoulder. "The past has a way of finding us, my dear. But now at least you know the truth." And as the storm raged outside, Caroline Forsyth closed her eyes, letting the weight of 15 years of secrets finally settle. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.